Welcome to Heart Over Gold, the channel where love, kindness, and humanity shine brighter than any fortune. In today's story, 3 years ago, Ethan Maxwell was at the top of the world, a powerful millionaire CEO with a thriving company and a beautiful wife, Eleanor, by his side. But, blinded by ambition and pride, he failed to see the cracks forming in their marriage. Eleanor's quiet pleas for attention were met with cold dismissals, and her loneliness grew until she walked away. Now, after years of silence, fate brings Ethan face to face with Eleanor again, and with the children he never knew he had. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, and keep up with our latest stories. The billionaire CEO's reckoning began long before he realized it. It didn't start with the tears, the absence, or the crushing silence that would later follow. It began quietly, in the moments he thought didn't matter, in the careless words he spoke without thinking, and in the things he failed to notice about the woman who once looked at him as though he was her whole world. 3 years later, all of those moments would come rushing back when Ethan Maxwell, a man who had spent his life building walls instead of bridges, found himself standing in front of the 2 little girls he had never met, but who carried his eyes, his blood, and every ounce of love he had once turned away from. Ethan Maxwell had always believed that order, control, and discipline were enough to keep his life exactly where he wanted it. From the outside, he looked like the picture of success, a young, brilliant CEO whose companies expanded so quickly that even the financial papers struggled to keep up. Investors admired him, competitors feared him. His suit was always sharp, his charm precise, his presence impossible to ignore. But beyond the spotless glass walls of his London office, away from the boardroom applause and champagne toasts, there was another Ethan, one far less patient, far less kind, and far less willing to bend. That Ethan came home late without a word, dropped his keys on the counter without asking how her day was, and met Eleanor's gentle questions with cold impatience. He told himself that showing her this harder side was honesty that she deserved. To see the real man she had married, the truth was uglier. The truth was that he resented how icily her gaze could fill with disappointment when he missed another dinner, how her soft voice could tremble when she asked why his work always came first. He convinced himself she was too sensitive, too naive, to understand what ambition demanded. When she tried to talk about how lonely she felt, about her worries for their future, he answered with sarcasm or silence. He told her she was weak, that she didn't understand how hard he worked to keep their life intact. He even believed it for a while. The night she left wasn't the explosion he might have expected. There was no screaming, no slammed doors. He came home late, as always, tie loosened, mind still full of numbers and contracts. The apartment felt unusually quiet, but he thought little of it until he noticed the missing suitcase. On the kitchen counter, a single folded note waited for him. In her careful handwriting, it read, "There's nothing left to wait for." That was all. No accusations, no requests, just a single sentence that hit harder than any argument they had ever had. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, the paper trembling in his hand, before placing it down with the same precision he brought to signing million-pound contracts. Then he poured himself a drink, looked out at the London skyline, told himself she'd be back in a week or 2. She'd realize she had overreacted. She'd know he hadn't meant most of what he'd said. She'd see that he was doing his best. He believed it so strongly that he didn't even call her. He didn't ask if she was safe. Days passed. He buried himself in work. If anyone in the office noticed his sharper temper or the way his usual quick wit seemed dulled, they didn't dare mention it. He told himself the hollow feeling in his chest was just disruption, not regret. But at night, when the city lights glittered below and the silence stretched too far, he sometimes wondered what might have happened if he had simply asked her to stay. Weeks turned to months, months to years. Ethan became even more consumed by his work, traveling so often that his apartment's staff stopped expecting him before dawn. His reputation as the man who never lost focus became unshakable. And yet, whenever he saw a blonde woman in the street, or heard a laugh that sounded too much like hers, something inside him twisted. 3 years passed before fate, or something like it, stepped in. He was leaving a lunch meeting when he happened to glance through the wide window of a small cafe. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks. But no, sitting there, her profile bathed in soft light, was Eleanor. Her hair was longer now, tied into a loose braid. She looked a little older, a little more tired, but still achingly familiar. Beside her sat 2 tiny girls pressed close against her sides. They couldn't have been more than 3 years old. It took Ethan several seconds to understand what he was looking at. Twins, the same soft brown hair, the same delicate features that tugged at memories he thought he'd buried. And then one of them looked up at him, her eyes meeting his through the glass eyes, the same deep brown as his own. He froze. The world outside kept moving, cars, strangers, the hum of the city, but he stood still, heartbeat roaring in his ears. In that moment he knew, while he had been building an empire, she had been building a family, a life without him, and suddenly, the distance he had clung to didn't feel like power, it felt like cowardice. He didn't remember crossing the street or opening the cafe door. All he knew was that he was standing inside, and Eleanor had turned to look at him. The expression in her eyes wasn't anger. Maybe that would have been easier. No, it was something heavier. Resignation. The little girls had gone silent, studying him with wide, curious eyes. He felt every defense he'd ever built crumble. He tried to speak but found no words that weren't too late. What happened next was not a reunion, it was something quieter, heavier, and more fragile than that. And it was the moment Ethan Maxwell's life stopped being a story about control and started being a story about truth. No apology could erase the years she had spent alone, for the first time in as long as he could remember. Ethan Maxwell felt the certainty he had built his life upon shatter into something raw and unrecognizable. He didn't know if he could ever fix things, but as he looked at the girls, his daughters, he knew that no matter what it took, he would spend the rest of his life trying. When Ilalana finally agreed to let him walk them home, Ethan felt both relief and a kind of dread. Heck couldn't have described if he'd tried. He offered to carry the bag she'd brought for the girls, and she didn't protest, which somehow made it worse. The four of them stepped out of the cafinto, the late afternoon light, and the city around them moved as if nothing had changed, as if this moment wasn't quietly reordering the shape of his entire life. The girls each held one of Eleanor's hands, their matching strides so natural he felt like an intruder just for walking behind them. Every few seconds, one of them, still trying to remember which name belonged to which gentle voice, would glance over her shoulder at him, as if checking who was real. He kept repeating that question in his head. Are you going to take us with you? He wondered how many times in their short lives they'd worried about losing the only security they'd ever known. The thought was so painful he could barely breathe. When they reached the pedestrian crossing, Eleanor looked back to see if he was still there. He knew she was measuring every move he made, every tone in his voice, trying to decide if he was about to hurt them all again. He didn't blame her. If the situation had been reversed, he doubted he would have found his presence anything less than a threat. Their building was small, older than the sleek places he was used to, but their steps were clean, and the potted plants on the windowsills looked healthy. When she unlocked the door, the girls released her hands and dashed inside ahead of them, their shoes thudding softly on the worn wooden floor. Ethan followed more slowly, feeling as if he were trespassing. Eleanor closed the door behind him, not speaking, and moved into the kitchen to put down the grocery bag. He remained near the entrance, watching the space that had been her home, while he had been too proud or too scared to ask where Shay had gone. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator, childish scribbles off-color that spelled out names and crooked hearts, a row of tiny shoes lined up by the door. On the narrow living room mantelpiece was a face-sewn photo frame, and he didn't have to pick it up to know what it held. He could feel every lost year pressing in on him, each one heavier than the last. The girls returned from the bedroom, now in matching star-patterned pajamas. One of them, the one he thought must be Mia, held a stuffed rabbit in one hand and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. After a moment, she held it out to him, her small fingers clutching the worn ear. He took it slowly, his hand trembling more than he wanted to admit. The soft toy was lighter than he expected, but in that moment, it felt like the most significant thing he had ever been entrusted with. "Thank you," he said softly, his throat rough. She didn't smile, but nodded once and returned to her sister's side. In the kitchen, Eleanor was filling a kettle. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "They don't know everything," she said carefully. "They just know you weren't ready to be here. I told them it wasn't your fault." He felt something sharp twist in his chest. "It wasn't," he said immediately, though the words felt too small. "It was mine." She set the kettle down and finally met his gaze across the small kitchen. "I don't know why you're here now. I don't know if you think this is something you can fix." "I don't think I can fix it," he admitted, each word rasping. "I just couldn't keep pretending they didn't exist, that you didn't." Her eyes flashed for a second, but she looked away before he could measure if it was anger or something else. She crossed her arms over her chest. "I didn't have the energy to work this out for you," she said. "I've spent 3 years making sure they never felt unwanted." "I know," he said, "because that was the only thing I could offer. and I'm sorry you had to do that alone." For a moment, the only sounds were the soft bubbling of the kettle and the distant voices of the girls playing in the next room. He wished there were more words he could give her, but none would have made it easier. So he stood there, letting Thessalon's say what he couldn't, that he saw what she had carried, that he finally understood the cost. When the kettle clicked off, she turned to pour the water. He didn't follow her. He just closed his eyes and let the ache in his chest remind him that this was real, that he could no longer pretend he hadn't chosen this absence. Whatever came next, he knew he had to start by staying still long enough to feel what had happened, trying not to feel. Ethan hadn't expected Eleanor to invite him to dinner, but when the girls appeared at the doorway to ask if he could help them set the table, Ellie normally sighed and gave a small nod. He followed them into the kitchen, feeling as if he was stepping into someone else's life, one that had moved on. Without him, the table was small and scratched in places, but it was obviously much loved. The girls knew exactly where their plates went, and they explained the rules to him in hushed, serious voices. Mia liked the blue cup. She wanted the spoon with the flowers on the handle, and both needed their napkins folded into triangles. He did everything they asked, grateful for something tangible to focus on, something that felt like participation instead of regret. Eleanor moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that made it clear she'd been doing this alone for a long time. She warmed soup and buttered slices of bread while the girls chatted about a show they liked and took turns asking him questions. He wasn't prepared to answer. Did he have a cat? Why did he wear shiny shoes? Why hadn't they seen him before? Each question was phrased with the blunt honesty only children possess, and each one landed in his chest like a small, necessary wound. He answered what heckled, admitting he didn't have a cat, that his shoes were for work, that Hesselt have come much sooner. When he said that last part, both girls fell silent. Mia studied him with wide eyes, as if trying to decide if she believed him while she snuggled into her sister's side, her small hand gripping the edge of the table. They ate dinner in a silence that wasn't entirely comfortable, but wasn't angry either. More than once he looked up to find Elena watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, that it wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't scorn either, and somehow that was harder to bear. After dinner, the girls disappeared into their bedroom to pick out a bedtime story, leaving him alone with her in the kitchen. She began rinsing dishes without a word. He took a breath and reached for a drying towel, unsure if she would tell him to stop, but she only nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and continued working. They moved beside each other in the small space, their shoulders brushing occasionally, and he was startled by how normal it felt, as if this would have been their life if he hadn't walked away. When the last dish was neatly stacked in the drying rack, Eleanor rested her hands on the counter, her head bowed. Her voice was so soft he almost didn't hear it. "They think you're a stranger who wants to be their friend." He swallowed, his throat tight. "I don't blame you for telling them that." She shook her head without lifting it. "I didn't know what else to say. You can't just show up after 3 years and expect them to understand." "I know," he said. "I don't expect them to. I don't expect you to." She finally looked up and her eyes were tired in a way that made him want to sink to hiskness and apologize until there was nothing left to forgive. But she didn't look away. Why now, Ethan? He'd asked himself that question 1,000 times the past week, and the answer still felt inadequate. Why did I see them? Why couldn't I keep pretending I hadn't made the worst mistake of my life? Her face didn't soften, but something in her shoulders seemed to ease. "I'm not going to make this easy for you," she said. "You can't just walk back in and feel better just because you finally showed up." "I know," he said again, because anything goals would have been an insult. From the hallway came the sound of small voices calling for their mother. Elena straightened and took a deep breath. "I'm not saying you can't be a part of their lives," she said in a low voice. "But if you are, you have to be Alan. You can't disappear again." He nodded, feeling something inside him settle in a way it hadn't in years. "I'm not leaving," he said, and he said it with every cell of his body. She didn't respond, but she didn't argue. When she turned and walked down the hall towards the girl's room, he followed her, his heart pounding at the thought that this was the first small step towards something he might never fully deserve, but would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. That night, Ethan sat on the edge of the living room sofa, listening as Eleanor read to the girls in their bedroom. The soft cadence of her voice drifted down the short hallway, mingling with the occasional sleepy question and the rustle of blankets. As they settled in for the night, he didn't try to pretend he belonged there. Not yet. He kept his hands clasped in his lap and studied the photographs lined up on the narrow mantelpiece beside the TV. There were snapshots of birthdays, blurry photos of the girls in a park he'd never visited, a grainy picture of Eleanor smiling at them as they clung to her legs. He realized with a dull ache that he wasn't in a single frame, and he knew he had no right to feel sorry for himself. She had built a life around the space he'd left behind, and she had done it without asking him for anything. When Eleanor emerged, she seemed surprised to find him still there, though she quickly masked it. She closed the door halfway behind her, leaving it open just enough to hear if the girls called. She seemed unsure what to do next, as if she hadn't planned for him to stay after dinner. For a moment, they just looked at each other, and Ethan could feel how raw the distance between them still was. He gestured to the far end of the sofa, and after a few seconds she sat down, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. Neither of them spoke. The silence was dense with everything they hadn't said, everything that had been waiting for years to surface. Finally, he forced himself to break it. "I know you don't owe me anything," he began, his voice low. "Not an explanation, not a chance, but if you'll owe me, I'd like to be here for them, in whatever way you think is right." She didn't look at him as she replied. "I don't know what's right anymore," she said. "I've spent so long just trying to make sure they were happy. I didn't think about what it would be like if you came back. I wouldn't blame you if you told me to leave," he said quietly. "I would understand." Elena closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against her knees. When she lifted her head again, her voice was firmer. "I don't want to pretend this is easy. It isn't, but I see the way they look at you even now, like they're waiting to find out if you're real." He felt something catch in his chest. He said simply, "I am real, and I'm not leaving." She took a long breath, as if trying to gauge if she believed him. "They need consistency. You can't be here one week and gone the next." "I know." His voice broke, and he didn't try to hide it. "I won't." The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. Less like an abyss, and more like the fragile beginning of something neither of them could name yet. She shifted slightly, lowering her feet to the floor. "They'll have questions," she said after a while. "You'll have to answer them. You'll have to tell them why you weren't here." "I will," he promised. "I'll tell them the truth." "And what is that?" she asked, her eyes searching his face in the dim light. "That I was afraid," he said. "That I made a choice that I thought was the right one, and it was the worst thing I've ever done." His mouth trembled, but she didn't look away. For the first time, he thought perhaps she saw past her anger long enough to glimpse the regret that had consumed him alive from the moment he saw those girls in the cafe. A small voice called from the bedroom, and Eleanor rose, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She paused before walking towards them. "If you're going to be here," she said in a low voice, "then you'll have to earn it every single day." He nodded because it was all he could do. "I will." She disappeared down the hallway, and Ethan leaned back on the sofa, feeling the tension in his chest loosen a fraction. He knew nothing had been undone, but for the first time, he believed there was a path forward. It wouldn't be fast. It wouldn't be simple, but he was ready to walk it, even if it took the rest of his life. Ethan began returning the following afternoon, unsure if Eleanor would truly let him back in, but when she opened the door, she simply stepped aside without a word. The girls were sitting on the living room rug, surrounded by a tangle of crayons and coloring books. When they looked up and saw him, their expressions were cautious but curious, and something in his chest tightened at how tentative their welcome was. He sat on the floor beside them, careful not to invade their space, and waited. Several minutes passed before Mia slid one of the coloring books closer to him, not looking him in the eye. It felt like the biggest invitation he had ever received. He picked up a crayon and began to fill in the edge of a cartoon flower. His hand was steady, but inside he felt like might break from the quiet enormity of it. Eleanor remained in the kitchen, tidying and pretending not to look, but he knew she was listening to every word, every hesitant question. Mia asked him what his favorite color was, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear her. He told her it was blue, the same as her dress. She wanted to know if he liked pancakes, and when he said yes, she nodded solemnly, as if that confirmed something important about him. They didn't ask why he had left yet. He knew questions would come, but he was grateful for the grace of their innocence in these first small moments. When it was time for dinner, he offered to help, and to his surprise, Eleanor didn't argue. She passed him vegetables to chop, and they worked in unawkward silence, punctuated by the girls' chatter from the table. He never realized how many small routines were woven into their evenings. Who had what plate, who always asked for extra milk, who needed their food cut into tiny pieces even though she insisted she was big enough to do it herself. Watch it and move through it all with tired patience made something twist in his chest. He had been so sure he knew what mattered, and yet he had missed this entire life growing up without him. After the girls were in bed, he stayed to wash dishes again. Elena dried without comment, but this time it didn't seem like she was waiting for him to leave. When they finished, they ended up in the living room again, both too exhausted to pretend they didn't have more to say. She sat in the armchair with her legs tucked under her and he remained on the sofa, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. "Do you ever think about how you would have been if you had stayed?" she finally asked. He lifted his head, meeting her eyes across the small space between them. Every day his throat worked as she swallowed. "I used to imagine you coming home," she said. "I'd think of all the things I'd say to you if you knocked on the door. Some nights I'd rehearse it in my head. All the ways I'd tell you how much it hurt." He didn't move, fearful that any reaction would break the fragile honesty between them. "And then one day," she continued, her voice thinner now, "I realized I didn't want Tobe angry anymore. I just wanted it to be over." "I don't blame you," he said, his own voice unsteady. "You were right to leave." She looked away, blinking rapidly. "Back doesn't mean it was easy." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't try to fill the silence. They sat like that for a long time, both caught between the past and whatever this was becoming. When she finally stood up, he rose too, thinking she was about to ask him to leave. But instead, she said in a low voice, "You can come tomorrow if you want." "I want to," he said without hesitation. She nodded once, her gaze to Danto steady, but tired. "Then come early. They'll be up by 7 o'clock. Something in his chest relaxed, just a little. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution, but it was permission to keep showing up, and for now, that was enough. Ethan arrived before 7 the next morning, just as she'd told him he could. He stood on the pavement for a moment, looking up at the second-story window where the curtains already stirred, and realized his hands were trembling. It was a small thing, this Ratin, but it felt like the most important commitment he had ever made. He knocked softly, almost afraid she'd changed her mind overnight, but when Eleanor opened the door, she just looked at him for a moment with her reserved, tired expression, and then stepped aside for him to enter. The girls were still in their pajamas, hair stuck in soft angles, faces bright with the simple excitement of morning. When they looked up and saw him, they didn't hesitate this time. Mia ran straight to him and wrapped her arms around his legs as if she'd been waiting all night to do so. He knelt down and lifted her, feeling her small weight cuddle against his chest in a way that burned his throat. Eleanor stayed back by the sofa, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. Butch didn't look scared. She was studying him the same way she had in the cafe, as if gauging if he would still be here if she looked away. He helped them make breakfast, moving carefully and not to break the rhythm of their morning rituals. Eleanor handed him plates without a word, and he set him down as Mia announced he would sit next to her because she was big enough to reach the cereal. They ate together in a broken silence, only shattered by the girls' chatter and the scraping off spoons against bowls. Every time he looked up and saw them watching him, curious, expectant, so trusting it ocked his chest. He felt the weight of every decision he'd made that kept him away from this table. But there was no undoing the past. Only the quiet reservado be different now. After breakfast, the girls insisted on showing him their favorite game, a collection of mismatched wooden blocks. They used to build houses that never stood for long. He sat cross-legged on the floor as they pressed pieces into his hands and explained in overlapping voices which blocks were special and which were just normal. Eleanor stood by the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, but she didn't interrupt. He caught her watching them more than once, her eyes softening as she observed the improbable sight of the three of them on the rug, heads bent together in concentration. By mid-morning, Mia tugged on his sleeve and asked in her small, serious voice if he would come back tomorrow. When he promised he would, she felt like she'd been waiting for that answer all along and returned to her block tower. Eleanor said nothing, but when he held out his hand, she came without hesitation, curling her fingers around his, as if she had always done so. The day unfolded in small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary simply because he had never imagined he would be allowed to have them. He helped them tie their shoes, read the same story 3 times, Becca's. They begged him not to stop. He held Mia on his hip as she pressed her cheek against his shoulder and sighed as if she had finally found her place. Bisondan, as Eleanor washed dishes, and he sat on the sofa with both girls leaning against him. He looked around the small apartment and realized it had become something sacred to him, a place where he was no longer a stranger. When the girls finally fell asleep, Eleanor stood beside him. She looked tired in a way that went beyond the day, but her voice was steady. "I don't know what this will look like," she said softly. I don't know how long it will take for me to trust you again. I don't either, he admitted, feeling no need to pretend. But I'm not going to stop coming back. She searched his gaze. Her eyes rested on the girls' sleeping faces. They've been waiting for you, she whispered, even if they didn't know it. His chest tightened and he looked at her, searching for any sign that she might ask him to leave, but she didn't. She simply stood there with him, sharing the silence. When he finally stood to leave, he leaned over the girls and kissed each of them, their hair warm and soft against his lips. As he straightened, he met Eleanor's eyes again, and this time there was something there he hadn't seen in years. Something like the beginning of forgiveness. I'll see you in the morning, he said, and she didn't argue. He walked out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt certain of one thing. He couldn't change the man he had been, but he could decide who he would be now. And he knew as he walked downstairs into the cool night air that he would spend the rest of his life showing up for them, proving that this time he was never leaving again.